Uh, Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all sitting comfortably. I assume that everyone can hear and see me. Mark, I've got your image up. Can you just confirm you can hear me?
Yep, I can hear you loud and clear, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Okay, one of the joys of the internet is that we can bring things together quickly and we can discuss things openly. The last week, the United Nations had its World Day Against Trafficking, and the purpose of today is to basically to look at some of the issues that were raised as part of that day of action. One of the comments on the UN website, which I find most interesting, is the crime of human trafficking has conquered cyberspace. It's quite a broad allegation that basically cyber criminals acting to promote trafficking of people has taken over the internet. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that. However, it does go on to talk about the opportunities that are offered to traffickers, tools to recruit, to exploit, to control victims, to organise themselves, making payments, transfer of money, and a whole range of activities that are now undertaken online. And this year, the UN wanted to concentrate on the use and abuse of technology within the realm of trafficking. So we've brought a few people together in order to help discuss that. So I'm going to do a very brief introduction to each of the three participants, and then just ask them to do a brief intro, and then we can fire off with some of the initial issues. On your Teams, you should be able to access the chat, so please feel free to fire in any questions that you have. Well, first and foremost, we've got Mark O'Donoghue, who's a serving Detective Chief Inspector, and is probably, I would guess, Mark, the highest ranking serving police officer dealing with these issues in the UK. Vast experience of working with international agencies, representing the UK, bringing best practice back to the UK, and also sharing best practice with a lot of international police forces. So we're really glad to have you on. We should also have Alan Doherty, himself a retired officer who has had vast experience of investigating a major crime, mostly within the West Yorkshire area, and since retirement about 10 years ago has become an expert in modern slavery and chairing a number of national organisations looking at that subject. So we'll bring him in a minute. And we're really pleased to have Alex Caithness. Alex is one of the stars, if not the biggest star, of an organisation or a company called CCL Digital Forensics, who provide digital services to a range of law enforcement agencies across the UK and internationally, as well as a number of independent private businesses. So we're really pleased to have him on board. His technical title is Principal Analyst, but he's a hell of a lot more than that, as he'll explain in a moment. So, Mark, could I just ask you to just sort of paint a picture, a little bit about your experience, but then paint a picture of what the problems being faced by law enforcement are at the moment?
Yes, yeah, thanks, Stuart. It's a very nice intro. I just want to correct you in respect that I'm not exactly the highest serving ranking officer in respect of this particular crimes. There are many others within the police service that are actually got a higher responsibility other than I have. I had a very small part to play in all of this, and it mainly related to modern slavery and human trafficking in Vietnam. My background, I'm a serving police officer of 28 years, majority of that time as a detective. And I was quite fortunate about 7 years ago to have the opportunity to be seconded to the Foreign Office and then subsequently the Home Office as part of what was called the Joint International Policing Hub, which is now part of the Home Office under its International Police Assistance Service. I've moved slightly on from that on a sideways move in relation to my career. But one of the key areas that I was involved in between 2017 and 2021 was the development of a modern slavery human trafficking investigation training program for the Vietnamese Police Academy, in partnership with the modern slavery unit of the Home Office and the British Embassy in Hanoi. And as a consequence of that, that's how I came into this world of both human trafficking and the international world of policing. So that's just a very brief outline about how I became involved in all of this.
Great, and absolutely on time. We have Alan Doherty. Alan, welcome. And could I ask you if you could just do a very short background intro and just what's the position as you see it at the moment? You're on mute.
Yeah, maybe the challenges to human trafficking and technology as the fact that people don't know how to use Microsoft Teams properly, and I'll put my hand up as being one of them. So my background is also law enforcement. As you know, Stuart, I spent 30 years in West Yorkshire, retiring as the divisional commander of Airedale and North Bradford Division. Prior to being the divisional commander, I was a senior investigating officer. I was head of the major crime unit, and I did the usual sort of career path within the police and worked on various squads and departments investigating crime. I think the most relevant experience is I eventually left the police, worked for a number of organisations, but eventually worked for an organisation which investigated human trafficking in the UK, and led two teams of investigators based in the Midlands and in Yorkshire, and we were responsible for rescuing over 200 victims of human trafficking, and also successfully prosecuted the first director in the UK for being complicit in modern slavery offences, and he received a custodial sentence at Crown Court. I now work as an independent consultant, and I assist organisations to comply with the Modern Slavery Act. But in addition to that, I am an independent chair employed by the Home Office Modern Slavery Unit. My role is to scrutinise decisions that they have made where they have rejected victims as being a victim of modern slavery. And I see an awful lot of those cases coming through me on a weekly basis. And I certainly see a lot of Albanian and a lot of Vietnamese people who claim to be victims. And in many of those cases, they are involved in forced criminality, either committing crime or, more often than not, cannabis factory cultivations. And certainly the use of mobile phones and the technology that are embedded in mobile phones is crucial to being able to actually make a decision on their credibility and whether or not they're actually been telling the truth to the Home Office or not. So I'm very interested in this morning's debate. And I think that if all agencies could up their game in terms of harvesting high quality technology, it assists the victims and it assists the agencies trying to deal with them.
Thanks very much, Alan. And Alex Caithness, can I just ask you just to say a few words, a little bit about yourself, but also then, you know, paint a picture of how you see this problem progressing. We've not got your sound on.
How about now? There we go.
Well, yep, that's much better. Thank you.
That was belt and braces muting there. Hi, I'm Alex. I work at CCR Forensics. We're a service provider for digital forensics. I've worked in the industry for just coming up on 15 years now. Believe it or not, I can't believe it. I began my life working in our mobile phone lab, dealing with casework relating to mobile phones. It was a really fantastic time to begin in that world because it was about 6 months before the first iPhone arrived, which of course changed the type of data that we were expecting to see on phones forever. Since then, I have moved to head up our research and development department, where we deal with new stuff that isn't supported by the mainline tools, unusual devices, unusual data sources, and increasingly these days old stuff as well, which has fallen out of the purview of the mainline tools. It's amazing. We had a 6230 in the lab, Nokia, from right when I started, and none of the tools deal with it anymore. So we have to go back to the ways we were doing it back then. I think one of the issues that we see as we're assisting our partners in law enforcement is, as has always been the case, the breadth and depth of data which is available on these devices, whether or not the tools can acquire that and make sense of that data to begin with, and then whether or not that data can be, its nuance can be understood in order to be made the most of in an investigation. I think that is a real challenge because there's so much data and there's not always the understanding of how to make use of that data to its fullest.
Thanks, Alex. Can I turn to Mark? What are the problems in being able to secure evidence and data from devices or from networks? Is that something that either within the UK or the international community is finding a problem?
There are a couple of challenges in relation to this. If you think about the legislative process here in the UK, you've got legislation like RIPA that police and law enforcement organisations have to deal with, and that creates its own problems, but it also creates the pathway for proper investigations and the correct identification of potential intelligence and evidence. On an international stage, where you have law enforcement agencies, depending on the nature of the country that you are engaging with, there are varying degrees of professionalism and opportunities to be able to interrogate technical information such as iPhones or laptops, etc. And that creates its own problems as well, because other countries have their own legislation for dealing with and obtaining information and intelligence from devices, and therefore that creates a potential challenge when it comes to UK investigations as to how that intelligence or potential evidence is going to be shared, whether it's through an MOU, through the particular law enforcement and governments, or potentially in some cases there just isn't the infrastructure within countries to understand how to gather this intelligence, and ultimately, as Alex says, how to interpret and use that intelligence or material that's on those devices and use it for the purposes of doing a human trafficking or modern slavery investigation. So they're just a couple of the challenges that are potentially facing law enforcement. But ultimately, one of the things that I found across working on the international stage is the collaborative process, where there is insufficient collaboration between law enforcement organisations. You have a deficit potentially of where you can actually take your investigations to. So for me, the relationships that are developed both across government and across government departments and across law enforcement organisations, whether that's police, border guards, customs officials, that is key to the development and the process of actually gathering this material for prosecutions and for the use of identifying organised criminality that ultimately deal with human trafficking issues. So they're just a couple of points, but I'm sure Alan and Alex will be able to pick up more in detail about the problems facing the sort of more technical side of things.
Thanks, Mark. Just for everybody's information, we've put the chat back on. So if you've got any questions or issues, please put them in the chat and I'll try and raise them. Alan, from your experience of dealing with these type of issues, how big a problem is dealing with technology, and both in evidence gathering and also from a sort of preventative safeguarding point of view?
Okay, it's difficult because of the sheer demand of the services of the sort of technical people who harvest the evidence from phones. It needs to be a fairly major case to justify a deep harvest of people's technology. And unfortunately, in the human trafficking field, when it comes to making a decision about a person's status, that's not something that the police particularly see as crucial. It's an afterthought to some degree. Their main focus, understandably, is prosecution of the offender. And if the harvesting of the information on the phone is not crucial to proving the case, because there may be other evidence which is overwhelming, then the police and the CPS won't actually push for that to be done, because it delays the case, it incurs additional expense, etc. So often they won't really push for that. The problem is, if the defendant is claiming that he has been forced into these crimes, then it's in the defendant's interest to get that phone analysed. But surprisingly, a number of victims refuse to cooperate and allow the police access to the phone, and that's where really the work tends to stop, because if the victim's not cooperating, for all sorts of different reasons. I mean, sometimes they don't cooperate because they're actually an offender, but other times they don't cooperate because of perhaps cultural misunderstandings, fear of authorities, or there's just been a breakdown in communication. Perhaps they're on remand and the phone's taken somewhere else, etc. So the fact that the actual evidence on the phone is not seen as a high priority in some cases is a problem. And it's just the sheer amount of information on phones as well. There's a lot of information. Only certain segments of that information is irrelevant to the case, but it's wading through the absolute, massive amount of data and having the time for someone to wade through that, pick out the bit that's relevant, and then actually present it in court. So maybe allowing more junior officers rather than technical officers to actually be able to do that, to upskill them, would help. But when we're all trying to force all these requests to a very small number of technical specialists, there's a huge backlog, and you have to prioritize. And unfortunately, it's the terrorism cases and the major cases that tend to get the okay, and these other smaller cases have to wait their turn. And sometimes by the time you've waited so long, the case has actually gone to court and been dealt with.
Alex, Alan mentioned there about the volume of information that's available, and I assume both data from specific devices like phones, but also social media. How can the police better organise that and come out with a better way of understanding what's going on?
So I think one of the issues that we see, and it varies across the UK forces a little bit, is whether or not there has been a useful forensic strategy developed ahead of this investigation. The reality of most forensic tools, digital forensic tools, these days is that for the most part, the default is for them to get as much as they possibly can from a particular device running a particular operating system. The skill then is less than to make sure you're getting all of the data. It's to understand where you should be looking to identify certain things. So quite often, speaking as a service provider, and I'm sure it's similar for those working in high-tech crime units, the remit of the investigation is often defined by a non-technical investigator, essentially, and it's more about I want to see communication, for example, and given the time constraints that these units are working under, generally speaking, people do what they are told and provide that output. Whereas if the strategy was developed with a collaboration between the technical and the investigation side of things, you might think of other areas which might be more useful or additionally useful to focus on. So, for example, other things that might show patterns of life and behavioural information might be crucial in these sorts of cases if you want to show association and other activity. But it will sometimes be overlooked because the tight remit of the submission is adhered to without question because of these time constraints. One thing that struck me, if I may also say something, what Alan was just saying, is that I see a parallel with some of the work that's going on in the UK around doing a better job for victims of crime, especially with rape and sexual assault, and some of the movement that's been happening in the UK around kitting frontline officers with the ability to do this sort of extraction and do this sort of extraction in a way that promotes trust, where the victim has a better understanding of what data has been extracted, and if there are issues around trust and cultural understanding of authority, some of those parallels might be worth considering, with the caveat that we end up in the same place where a non-technical person is deciding the remit and what is being extracted there. That strategy needs to be in place ahead of that work.
Thanks for that, Alex. Alan, just picking up on that point, do you, and then I'll come to you, Mark, straight afterwards, but there's sort of, what should cops be able to do? What should police officers be able to access? And Alex's point about the difference between a technical and a non-technical officer. How can you make a decision about what technical support you need if you don't understand what support is actually available? Can I ask you just to briefly go on to that, and then I'll come over to Mark?
Well, I mean, we're seeing frontline officers now do some of the work that forensic scientists used to do 20 years ago. So, back in the day, any drugs that were seized had to go to a lab, had to be examined. Now we're seeing frontline officers who have got relatively not a lot of experience, or are able to give expert evidence and actually say this is cannabis, and it allows us to move a lot more cases through without clogging up forensic science. And it's the same principle, really. So when it comes to certain elements of telephone data, I think it would be possible for frontline officers to be upskilled sufficiently to put through fairly low-level data just to sort of fill some gaps in, without replacing the real experts who are there to get the metadata and all that sort of background stuff that most normal people don't understand. Preserve those for when it really matters. But I mean, in the cases that I'm talking about, it's crucial that the people that are claimed to be victims, if they don't consent to their phone being interrogated, then there's nothing in law that says we can take an adverse inference from that refusal. It's a dangerous area because, as I said before, some people might not trust authority. However, I think the Home Office's view is it is the victim's requirement to cooperate. Otherwise, it's almost impossible to make a judgment on their status. And if the victim is refusing to cooperate, then to some extent, the Home Office can be forgiven for not giving them the benefit of the doubt. So maybe there are some little bits of policy that need changing to allow for those instances. But I do think that most frontline police officers, given the right training, would be capable of at least extracting some data and presenting it in a particular way that would allow us to sort of progress a lot of these cases.
Thanks for that, Mark. Not expecting you to reply on all of that. You're not responsible for the entire training regime and strategy of the Police UK, although we think you probably do a good job at that. But your comments on what Alan and Alex have just said.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up in respect of there are a lot of challenges here in the UK based on what Alan and Alex have said about the digital forensics strategy and dealing with victims and whether they would hand over their phones, etc. One of the key areas for the work that I was doing was identifying the problem upstream in countries of issue. And one of those countries is Vietnam, and Alan mentioned Albania as well as one of the key countries where an awful lot of suspected human trafficking is taking place. What we need to remember is that in an awful lot of these countries, their law enforcement organisations are not necessarily respected by the general population, or if they are respected, they're more feared than the type of policing that we have here in the UK. And as a consequence of that, that creates a societal culture where there is a fear of dealing with government organisations, and therefore that transitions itself when you have people who end up in the UK fearing authority and therefore not engaging with police and law enforcement. So one of the key things for me when I was doing my work on human trafficking is trying to engage upstream and identifying opportunities with law enforcement in those particular countries that we would be able to cultivate a relationship and a sharing of information that would eventually bring a change in the mindset and the thinking of the law enforcement organizations of those countries that would actually bring a more victim focused approach to their investigations. Because ultimately, and Alan mentioned it earlier on, it was all about the prosecution side of things, and getting your prosecution successful home and getting offenders put away. The problem you have with that was that an awful lot of the time the victims were forgotten about, and as a consequence, that created an environment as well where victims feel that they haven't been looked after, and their problems that have been associated with human trafficking have not been addressed. So therefore, when you're looking at dealing with other countries, potentially what we can achieve by an education process and a relationship building process with their law enforcement and government organisations to prevent the problem arriving on the shores of the UK. And as a consequence of that, it's good to see that potentially when you have long-term ongoing relationships and programs such as human trafficking investigation, and now potentially moving into the sort of digital sphere, that's where we need to make an impact, I believe. Because once you make an impact in country, potentially you're creating an environment that it makes it not such an attractive process to travel to the UK and ultimately become a victim of human trafficking. So that side of it is more about the victimology side of things, victim focus, creating an environment where although you're dealing with a law enforcement process of gathering evidence, but actually creating a relationship with the victim as well to ensure that their welfare is being looked after as part of this.
Thanks for that, Alex. In relation to the sort of management of data, a lot has been spoken about social media, and in fact, the UN page dedicated to trafficking for this World Day does talk about use of social media. What tools are available to actually exploit that and try and draw down evidence that non-technical police officers, as we'll use that term, although some may question it, that non-technical police officers could use in order to either prevent or detect the trafficking offences?
So the first thing is that the tooling does exist. In the UK, whether or not we are able to use it in a law enforcement sphere is a slightly sticky question. It falls into two kind of camps. You have the tools which are designed to harvest the open source information from social media. So you can imagine things like Twitter feeds, things like the public facing information on Facebook and the like. And then you have the tools which are able to harvest a user's profile. So if you're interested in a particular user and you have the credentials to access their accounts, then most of the major social media platforms are supported by tools, and in various different ways in terms of actually gaining access to the accounts. So whether that's because you have the credentials and you've been given the opportunity to by the user to access their data, that can be done. There are also tools which will make use of tokens that are found on mobile devices. So where a mobile device has been logged into a particular social media platform, it's possible for some of these tools to grab that token and essentially impersonate the phone and gain the data that way. So the tooling exists and has done for some time. My take on it, and as an outsider, is that there are legislative risks associated by making use of this tooling, and in a lot of cases, social media and the wider cloud question in policing is one in the UK that although stuff is being done, it's not being done often. Whether or not it should be with the current legislation, that's not really my area to speak, but certainly I've seen a lot of reluctance to do that. But the
Thanks for that,
exists.
Alex. Alan, I'm going to bring you in because you've got your hand up, and then I want to, Mark, if you could have a think about the question from Ben. So do we need a stronger network of police attaches operating overseas? And we'll come to you as soon as Alan has finished.
Okay, Alex, this question is really for you, and it's going back to this issue of social media. So obviously, things like Instagram and Facebook, usually you have to be a friend of somebody in order to see the content that they're putting on the account. I imagine it's certainly possible, I'm not sure how easy it is, to get the social networks to allow the police to at least look at the open source stuff, i.e. to sort of make them a friend so that the police can actually just look at the background on social media to sort of plot where someone has been, what sort of posts they've been putting on. Because, you know, those posts sometimes give you valuable information as to where people were at a certain time, which may or may not either contradict or confirm a previous account. So do the social networks allow law enforcement to view open source material, or is that also difficult?
Being able to essentially serve the warrant on the social media platforms is absolutely something that can be done, and is one of those things which, from a forensic strategy standpoint, it should be something that's identified early, because although a lot of these platforms do have offices in the UK, not all of them. So in many cases, it needs to be done via an MLAT, which obviously, as you are aware, is not necessarily the speediest process if it's not life at risk type situations. But absolutely, and certainly, I've seen a number of frustrations in cases where that opportunity isn't identified early enough, and because of data retention policies and the like, not only do you risk delaying an investigation, you do risk not getting that data at all. Again, just I hate to bang the drum about making sure there's a sound strategy in place, but this is, you know, another one of these areas where those leading on the investigation need to jump on this as early as possible if you're going to do it. I'll add also that not all of the social media platforms are headquartered in jurisdictions that are necessarily friendly to the UK. So there are those situations where there may not be a way in via the platform.
Thanks very much for that, Alex. Mark, can we go back to that question from Ben?
Yeah.
Do we need a stronger network of police attaches overseas complementing operational activity? And if so, how would that work?
Yeah.
Clearly, there's an issue of money, but let's just assume for the purpose of this that both Conservative candidates think it's a great idea, so the money will be there.
I will take this question from Ben on the basis of purely this is my own personal feelings and thoughts, and it doesn't reflect in any way the greater policing institutions here in the UK and National Police Chiefs Council who ultimately make decisions about policing. From my experience, there is a good requirement for a network of police attaches overseas from the UK. The current situation that we have is that we have in various countries, not all countries throughout the world, you have National Crime Agency officers, usually one per country, who are deployed, as well as, depending on the country, counter-terrorism liaison officers. Now, both of those type of officers have a specific role, and primarily their responsibility is either one, dealing with counter-terrorism, or two, dealing with serious and organised crime within the parameters of the National Crime Agency. Where you have a void, as it were, is local policing and the opportunities for what we would describe as your routine policing element of things, such as community orientated policing, dealing with modern slavery issues, dealing with human trafficking, dealing with issues potentially of not necessarily of a serious organised crime nature, but generally the relationship building of practical policing elements and inquiries that can be conducted on behalf of the UK in a foreign jurisdiction. And as one of the comments, I think it was Francis that popped in the chat box, the importance of having a global network of partners can be influenced dramatically by having a voice from policing as an attachment. And I know that here today there are a number of police attaches from the law enforcement community as well, from other countries that are posted here to the UK. And I think the benefit of that is, having worked with the foreign law enforcement community here in Britain, the relationships and the networks that you are able to create creates an environment of not only friendship, but the trust that the nature of the work that you're doing has some sort of value, and that you can call upon these police specialists, because they are specialists in their own right because of what the work they do on the international stage. It creates that environment for mutual sharing of knowledge, investigation and intelligence. Now, not all investigations potentially can, that they have to go through a formal process, but ultimately usually those formal processes start with a telephone call of who do you go to, what is the best process, what is the right network, what is the relationship that you have to develop to be able to either gather intelligence or turn it into evidence. And you've mentioned about the MLATs, etc., and MOUs and memorandums of understanding. So from a personal perspective, I feel that a network of police attaches from the UK would be highly beneficial to the work that we're trying to do on a global stage. If you think about having left the EU and our opportunities and the relationship that we have as part of the Global Britain brand, policing is one of those elements that has a great soft power influence around the world and can be utilised for not only the development and dealing with crime, but also for a wider agenda, such as government-to-government network, business and trade, dealing with societal problems. So from that perspective, I think yes, a greater police network or attaché network would be a fantastic idea.
Thank you for that, Mark. Alan, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting comment from Mark. There are clearly a lot of countries all over the world, and getting attachés in all these locations is a challenge because it's extremely expensive, etc. I just wondered, we're living in a different world now, a sort of virtual world, and this is all about technology this morning. And do we have, and if we do, is it possible that we were to have attachés embedded in organisations such as Facebook, Instagram? Because if we're saying that there is mountains and mountains of data in there that we'd like to get access to, would it not make sense to embed a police specialist in those organisations, so to smooth requests through, rather than go through, if we go down the avenue of a warrant every time we want to look at information, it's really difficult, really expensive, really time consuming. There may be instances where we can actually get access to things fairly quickly, rather more informally. But having an officer or a contact embedded in the organisation might just smooth things out. And I'll put that for open debate. Do we do it now, or could it be done? Would it be useful?
Mark, I think you were agreeing with that.
Could I just come in briefly on that? There is a network in the UK called GAIN, Government Agency Intelligence Network, and that is a coordinator, usually within the regional organised crime units, throughout England and Scotland. And what they do is they act as a coordinator for such things that Alan has mentioned. But from a wider perspective, I think there is a greater opportunity when you start looking at private industry and business, that there should be a greater connection between the police service and private industry, for the very reasons that Alan has mentioned there. But the GAIN community, if nobody knows, is a fantastic network, and if they're not already aware, they should make a point of making contact with their GAIN coordinator and understand exactly the relationships that they have with not only policing organisations but private industry as well. That could very much help their investigations in the future.
Thanks for that, Mark. Alex, it's sort of a continuation question, this, but one of the ambitions of the World Day from the UN is to use technological ingenuity to fight human trafficking. I think we've had lots of examples over the years of particularly law enforcement doing things that are a little bit crazy, a little bit ingenious and creative to achieve the outcome. What is there technically or what technical ingenuity do you think law enforcement could use to fight human trafficking in the future?
Well, that's a question to put me on the spot. Thanks, Stuart.
That's all right.
So I think one thing that that would certainly help, not just in this crime type, but in anything that spans even just multiple individuals, is a better way of identifying networks of criminality outside of the sort of the big organized crime groups. So if there was a more coordinated effort to proactively share information or proactively flag information where commonalities in investigations are identified. So, for example, if there is a particular crime type, say drugs cultivation, and particular phone numbers are turning up on multiple devices, if there was a way to flag to another force who come across those same phone numbers that, hey, force X is also looking at data that's related to this, where that sort of joined up approach could then be used. There are barriers to doing that in terms of overstepping, looking at data outside of what's relevant to the investigation. So it has to be done in a sensitive way, probably in an anonymized way, so the actual data is not being shared, but an identifier is being shared that could then be related back to a case by a force, and actually having something that allows, which highlights where opportunities for collaboration exist, and whether that's probably easier approached within just the UK, as he says flippantly, just the UK, knowing the difficulties that we sometimes have for collaboration in just the UK, but certainly for information sharing in a way that it doesn't share the information, because that's always the issue. Actually sharing the information is the issue. So sharing identifiers anonymized in a way that can be related back to a case, I think that would be a really interesting opportunity. And I know that some of that is happening in the UK, but maybe not as widely as it might be.
Yeah, just picking up a point that excuse me, Francis has just raised about big data, machine learning and artificial intelligence. Do you think that could be used by law enforcement to help reduce and to investigate modern slavery?
I think the big data side of things is precisely what I'm kind of talking about here. I know that there's always a push towards machine learning and artificial intelligence. I think we should always be wary of making use of those technologies where they don't necessarily have to be used, and I think we also need to be wary of I always say that we don't need more digital scientists, we need more philosophers. We need to be very careful of the ethics surrounding using those technologies, and not diving into the realms of precognition of crimes that might happen. I'm a lot of the time when people talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning, what they mean is just good old data analysis. But certainly in terms of if you can model particular types of networks and find them within the data set, then by all means. But I think there are other things that we should be doing before we get to that stage.
Excellent point, Alex. I think they're reminding us that we've got to live in an ethical, legal world. Things that we might like to do, but it has to be legitimate, and it has to be ethically clean as well. We've talked quite a bit about the sort of, well, this is the responsibility of law enforcement. There's other players that can have an impact on this, and I want to come back to you, Alan, on this if possible. There are other organisations, whether they're local authorities, whether there are other public providers, whether schools, for example, can they have an impact on identifying and preventing trafficking of people? And also, you know, is there a technical thing that could help them?
Well, I mean, you're sort of talking about, you know, partnership work. I know that it's improved dramatically over the last 20 years. I can remember when it really first began in sort of normal policing, and it has improved an awful lot. There are huge challenges there, because even though organisations are working with each other more, their technical departments don't work with each other, and everything's incompatible, and it's very difficult to get information sent from A to B. But, you know, there are sources of data available, probably in the NHS, and, you know, probably some of the benefit agents, etc., that would all be useful small pieces, jigsaw pieces, to plot someone's movements, someone's activities, someone's past. that would all be extremely useful in some cases. However, dependent upon, you know, if a victim's journey has taken him or her into the country from Dover, and they've ended up in Durham, and they've passed through many different areas during the course of 2 or 3 years, it's a really mammoth task to plot that journey, to harvest all the data that's been left during their journey. And I would say in only the most serious of cases, I mean, you're talking murders or something of that level, you know, would it be possible to start requesting those organisations for any data about that person's stay in their area, in order to plot their movements? I mean, in the most serious of cases, it would be worth doing, and it would be very useful. But in the sort of cases that I'm dealing with, they just don't justify the amount of time and effort it would take to get that. But absolutely, that data is there, and the NHS and benefits in particular would have an awful lot of information that we never see unless the victim actually introduces it and points us to it. Otherwise, we're just oblivious to it most of the time.
So there is a lot more that could be done with organisations like NHS, DWP.
Without doubt, and you know, if it were in a perfect world, you could put someone's name in the system, and it would spit out a chronological list of all encounters between that person and the organisation, which would be easy to read, and it would be sequenced in a timeline, and it would be really, really useful. But how you could make that happen, we'll probably still be talking about that in 20 years' time.
Mark, from a policing perspective, how does that work? What's the relationship between your colleagues and DWP, NHS, in terms of getting data out that might help you to identify trafficked people and offenders that go with them?
Most of the time, there's really good relationships between an awful lot of these organisations, because they all understand the nature of the seriousness of this particular type of crime. Alan's highlighted the technical problems that you encounter because of, you know, different systems don't talk to each other, etc. The other issue that you have as well is, if you don't ask for a specific piece of information, there is the potential that, irrespective of whether it could be part of an investigative process, may not be available or may not be supplied, purely because you've not specifically asked for that piece of information. So if you're thinking about where your investigation is going, and you're asking for one particular piece of material, and then there's other material that potentially could influence or assist in that, it's not necessarily within the receiving organisation who's actually providing you the information to decide whether that information is appropriate to be provided to law enforcement. And plus the fact as well, they're not, you know, these organisations are not law enforcement or investigation organisations, and therefore may not know and understand the nature of that potential material or information would be relevant to an investigation. So there are a number of challenges there, but majority of the time, from the experience I've had, an awful lot of organisations are very, very helpful to very helpful in coordinating and assisting police investigations. And I think there's a bigger push now across at a national level, that the partnership and relationships with all these organisations, whether they are government departments or NGOs, non-government organisations, there is an appetite to assist to deal with this particular type of crime. So if you don't ask effectively, you don't get. So, and one of the key areas, and Alex has mentioned it, and Alan has mentioned it earlier as well, is the relationship factor. It's developing those relationships with those organisations and the people within those organisations that will actually help drive this forward.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Mark. Alan, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to throw the issue of biometrics into the debate as well, because a lot of the victims that we see from other countries, come with almost no background. We have no idea who they really are and what they really have been doing prior to coming into the UK. It would be really useful if we have a fairly robust system of criminal records and things like that I think other foreign police forces can have access to with the necessary permissions and requests. But we see very little when we see victims' history as to what they've been doing, and in many cases, they have been involved in criminality, which again just gives you another little piece of the jigsaw to assess their credibility. And we don't seem to see an awful lot of information about their previous behaviour from their home countries. And I just wonder, would biometrics be something that would unlock all that information and allow us to get access to it and to certainly consider them with all the information that's relevant?
I think it's a very good point, Alan. Certainly would help in investigations. We're starting to come to the close now. I'd just like to give you each 30 seconds just to say, what would you like to see happen, irrespective of politics, legislation and money? What would you like to see changed over the next year or so that might have an impact on helping the UK to be a better place to address trafficking in people? Mark, can I ask you to start?
I wish you'd given me that question before so I could think about it, but on the hoof, I think there needs to be a greater push for the development of relationships with the countries of priority, such as Albania, such as Vietnam, such as Nigeria, developing relationships with their law enforcement organisations, but also their non-law enforcement, particularly in the charitable sector and human rights sector, where the development of civil society is being approached and pushed as part of their agenda. So I think greater relationships with those organisations, both from a law enforcement and the UK government perspective, would be highly beneficial.
Okay, Alex, before I come to you, I've got Francis who wants to raise an issue. Francis? Got a hand up. I'll make you a presenter. Francis? No, I think she's disappeared. Or Francis, sorry. Francis, he's disappeared. No, Francis, TK, hand up, question? No. Okay, Alex, over to you.
Well, my answer's generic to in investigations from a technical standpoint generally, and that is, this is kind of my stock answer, I have to apologise, but more training for investigators on what's possible from a technical standpoint, but I think also crucially, and I think this is often overlooked, more training or insight for the technical people in terms of what is useful for an investigation. I think because that then better facilitates collaboration between those two sides, which is going to provide better outcomes from that technical data every time.
Thanks, that's excellent. Alan?
Yeah, I think because of the volume of cases that we see coming through, I would like to see a fast tracking of access to people's digital data on phones, especially victims, where it is in their own interests to have the phone analysed to either confirm or disprove anything that's said. So something around the legislation there to actually get access to the data quickly, without prejudicing the safeguards around, the state being too intrusive into people's private data. When a victim is claiming to be a victim, and there is information there that is going to assist the process, there should be a lot easier pathway to getting access to that data without going through a high court, or a court order, etc. I think that some work around that needs to be looked at to try and improve things and quicken things up a little bit.
Excellent. As they say on Question Time, our hour is up. Thanks very much for our presenters. Could I just ask the presenters just to hang on for a couple of minutes, just for a quick debrief? And thank everybody for the questions and participation, and I hope you found it useful. We will be putting this into the September conference, and you'll be getting emails about that from Francis and Karen. So thanks everybody else for coming along, and wish you a good day.